There is a curious story recorded in Irish folklore. Collected dates around the 1840s. The story describes a farmer who claimed to have encountered a leprechaun while he was along the edge of a small stone field late one evening. According to the account, he first heard a faint tapping sound, a low and rhythmic sound like someone lightly hammering a metal piece in the distance. At first, he assumed it was another farmer repairing the fence, but when he followed the sound, he noticed something unusual. Sitting on a flat stone near the edge was a tiny figure, no more than 2 feet tall, dressed in dark green clothing, wearing a small coat. In his hand was a miniature cobbler hammer, which he seemed to be using to tap steadily against the shoe that he had rested upon his knee. Realizing what he was looking at, the farmer quickly grabbed the creature. According to Irish legend, capturing a leprechaun and forcing it to reveal the location of its hidden treasure will make you rich. The small figure immediately began to protest, shouting and squirming in the man's grip. Eventually, the leprechaun agreed to reveal the location of its gold, pointing towards a patch of weeds growing near the edge of the field. But the farmer, you see, he made a mistake. He looked away, and for a moment, when he looked back, the leprechaun was gone. The tapping sound had stopped, and the weeds where the treasure was supposed to be hidden was suddenly moving in the wind. Dozens of identical patches began to pop up across the field. If the gold had been there, it was lost once again, another trick of the fairy folk.
Some stories blur the line between reality and the unfamiliar. They whisper in the night, waiting to be heard. So let's listen. Let's talk spooky.
Welcome back, spooky souls, to a bonus episode of Let's Talk Spooky. Happy St. Patrick's Day to all my Irish listeners, and of course, anybody else who celebrates. I am so excited for this bonus episode because I find fairy lore incredibly fascinating. There's just something about diving into the fairy realm that I think has captivated us all a little bit. I mean, look at the books that are out there, full of fairy lore. But we're going to get into fairies in more depth in the spring because I feel like that matches their vibe a little bit better. But I wanted to explore a cousin of the fairies, and I feel like for today, this is a fitting character to include. Let's dive in to the legends and lores of the leprechaun. So if you're ready, grab a candle, hope you have the luck of the Irish on your side, and let's talk spooky. While many assume that the leprechaun is simply a modern invention of St. Patrick's Day, and if you're envisioning a little cereal box character, I'm here with you. But you might be surprised to know that there's a much darker version of the creature, one that seems to have been adapted and crafted into a much more manageable version for modern days. But one of the earliest written descriptions appears in medieval Irish stories, referring to a creature called Leprechaun. And the word roughly translates to small-bodied spirit, and these were said to be more mischievous supernatural beings, very human-like spirits who lived alone in the parts of the Irish countryside, primarily near hills, low trees, and ancient ruins. Unlike the grand fairy courts of Irish legend, these creatures were not part of large communities. They were very solitary, secretive, and often deeply suspicious of humans. More strikingly, however, they're not described as green or wearing green at all. Like in modern connections, these ancient creatures actually wore red. And in early folklore traditions across parts of Ireland, red was frequently associated with fairy beings from every lore. Some scholars believe that the color symbolizes the otherworld connection, the marking of a creature that doesn't necessarily belong in our realm. they belong just outside of the human world. And we see the use of red as an exterior part of realms or worlds in our more recent horror films. An example that comes to mind is the Red Door in The Haunting of Hill House. But in many of these early accounts, the creatures that we would come to call as leprechauns appear not as a lucky charm, but as one of these red-clad ferrymen, small, clever, and extremely difficult to outwit. And they are known to be cunning, sharp-tongued, and their love for deception has built quite a reputation. Travelers whom encounter one of these creatures are often offered a bargain, a promise of hidden gold, or the knowledge of buried treasure. But what happens if you accept them? Well, an old Irish storyteller often warned that the fairy world kept careful watch over its treasures, and that anyone foolish enough to steal from it rarely escaped without consequences. One story, told in rural parts of Ireland, speaks of a man who learned this lesson much too late. The man lived near a lonely stretch of farmland where stone fences divided the fields and the wind moved through the hedge groves like a whisper. He was not a man who believed in the fairy stories. He laughed at them whenever his neighbors spoke of strange lights in the hill or the dangers of disturbing old places. One evening, while he was walking home along a narrow path near his house, he heard something. The faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from beyond the hedges, where the land dipped slightly into a low hollow. When the man stepped through the grass, he looked down and saw a small figure sitting on the stone. He was no smaller than a child. The little man wore a red coat and a small hat that was pulled low over his brow. In his hand was a tiny hammer that he was tapping carefully on a shoe that rested across his knee. The man immediately knew what he had found. It was a leprechaun. And without thinking, he lunged forward and grabbed the creature before it could disappear. The leprechaun struggled fiercely, its sharp voice furious, and demanded its release. But the man held tight. Everyone knew the old rule. If you capture a leprechaun, never take your eyes off him. He would be forced to reveal where his treasure is hidden if he stays. Finally, the creature stopped struggling. Its eyes narrowed onto the man, and with a slow, bitter voice, it said, "Very well. I'll show you where the gold lies. But mark my words, man, you'll wish you'd left it buried." The leprechaun pointed towards a twisted hawthorn tree, standing alone at the edge of the field. The man forced the creature to sit beside him as he dug the roots of the tree. As long as he didn't take his eyes off him, he would be fine. It didn't take long before a shovel struck something hard beneath the soil. A small iron pot. Inside it were gold coins, hundreds of them. Satisfied, the man gathered the treasure and released the leprechaun, who vanished quickly into the grass without another word. For a few days, it seemed the man had outwitted the fairy folk. He spent his gold freely. He spoke proudly of his good fortune. And then when people warned him that the fairy treasure often carries curses, he laughed at their superstition, for they were the fools. But strange things began soon after. At night, he started to hear tapping sounds outside his cottage. Tap, tap, tap. Sometimes the sound moved across the walls as if something was circling the house. Sometimes it was above the roof. And others, it sounded like it was right outside his bedroom door. And each time the man opened the door to look, there was nothing there. Then the gold began to change. The gold coins darkened at first, their bright shine fading into a dull copper metal. And within days, they turned completely black. Others cracked and crumbled like brittle stone in his hand. And one morning, he woke to find that half the coins had become nothing more than a pile of damp leaves scattered across the table. But the worst part was the sound. The tapping followed him everywhere, across the fields, across the roads, even inside his house. Tap, 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 slow and patient, as if waiting. Neighbors noticed something strange about the man as the weeks passed. He grew thin and restless, always looking over his shoulder, always listening to the sound that only he seemed to be able to hear. And then one night, during a violent storm, the tapping sound stopped. The next morning, the villagers found his door to the cottage open, and inside, the house was empty. The chest where he kept his gold was overturned, filled only with dirt and dead leaves. But the man himself, he was never seen again. But sometimes, on quiet nights in parts of the countryside, people still claim they hear something moving through the hedges, beneath the wind, and a faint tapping sound that follows, like a tiny hammer striking metal, somewhere off in the dark. Stories like this were not unusual in rural Ireland. For centuries, people treated encounters with the fairy world with a deep caution. Leprechauns carried a reputation for cleverness and revenge, and many old tales warned that stealing their gold rarely ended well. Another example of a man who thought he could outsmart a leprechaun was proved to be sadly mistaken. But it was not the doing of the leprechaun in the end. It was the experience that drove this man absolutely mad. In 1838, a man named Seamus O'Malley claimed that he had discovered a small man in a red coat just outside his rural farmhouse in the western end of Ireland. Shortly after his claims, it is said that O'Malley disappeared for 3 solid days. And upon his return, he was different. He wouldn't speak to locals, he isolated himself in his farmhouse, and for weeks following the experience, locals say that at night they could hear O'Malley hysterically laughing from the house. Over time, things seemed to get worse for O'Malley. His once flourishing farm became barren and his livestock slowly died. Finally, after not seeing him in the fields for a number of days, neighbors went to look, and what they found was a truly horrifying sight. There, hanging from the barn rafters, was O'Malley. His experience was never investigated further, and his death was ruled self-inflicted, but the villagers knew better. There was something strange at play. Stories similar to O'Malley's were often told in a time when life in Irish families became increasingly more difficult. The 1840s were one of the darkest periods in Irish history. Beginning in 1845, a plant disease known as Phyrothora infestes ravaged Ireland, more commonly called potato blight, began to destroy potato crops around Ireland. And for millions of Irish families, potatoes weren't just a common food, they were a primary source of nutrition. Many rural households relied almost entirely on them to survive. And when the blight struck, the crop rotted from the ground up, and fields that had once enough food for entire families suddenly produced nothing but blackened, useless plants. And the crisis did not end after one season. The blight returned in 1846, and then again the years that followed. Within just a few years, the country was facing a catastrophic famine. Historians estimate that around 1 million people died from starvation and disease during this period of time, while another 1 to 2 million immigrated, leaving Ireland and its country behind for places like the United States, Canada, and Australia. Entire villages were abandoned, and families packed what little they had, boarded ships, many of them overcrowded vessels that later would be called coffin ships, because so many passengers would die upon the journey. The people who remained, their daily lives became a struggle just to survive. And during times like this, folklore often began to become incredibly important. Old stories about the fairy world, about hidden treasures, about spirits of the land, and mysterious creatures that lived in the hills were part of a cultural fabric of rural Ireland. And they weren't always taken literally, but they did carry warnings, lessons, and some kind of comfort that the hardship may end if they respected the land. Because even during the hardest years, the land itself still seemed alive with stories. Stories of fairy roads that should never be disturbed, about ancient mounds and small solitary creatures, cobblers of the fairy world, who guarded pots of gold hidden somewhere in the countryside, and the creatures that we now call the leprechaun. The Great Famine didn't just change the population of Ireland, though. It changed the path of their stories. For generations, Irish folklore had been passed down through the spoken language of storytelling, around hearth fires, in cottages, while working on the land. People shared these tales about the fairy world, about the banshee, about changelings, about ancient spirits of the hill, and small solitary tricksters known as the leprechaun. When Irish families settled in places like Canada, the United States, and Australia, those stories came with them. They became part of their cultural memory, and they were carried across the ocean, along with all of their belongings. In immigrant neighborhoods and rural settlements, people still spoke of fairy paths and how they should never be disturbed, and the dangers of interfering with a hidden world. Over time, these stories began to change again. As Irish communities adapted into their new countries and cultures, darker parts of the folklore often began to be softened. The dangerous fairy tricksters slowly transformed into more playful figures, small men who, instead of wearing red, began to be seen in green, guarded pots of gold with a joyous and funny grin. But during the same period, something else happened back in Ireland. Scholars and folklorists began to realize that many of these old oral traditions might disappear, when entire communities had been displaced, and with them, their storytellers, who had preserved these legends for generations prior. So in the early mid-19th century, writers began traveling through rural Irish communities, collecting stories that people still remembered. One of the most well-known of these is Thomas Crofton Croker's Book of Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland, which was published around 1854, and it helped preserve many of the tales about leprechauns and other fairy beings. And without these collections, and others who followed along suit, many of these stories may have vanished completely. Instead, they were preserved, carried across oceans, written into books, and passed down again through generations. Which is why today, nearly 2 centuries later, we still know the small little clever man with the fairy cobbler hammer, who is said to live somewhere in the hills of Ireland. But as Irish immigrants built new communities abroad, their folklore began to blend with the celebration and identity of their new land. Days and celebrations, such as St. Patrick's Day, became a way for immigrant communities to maintain that connection with home. Over time, certain symbols rose to the surface: the shamrock, the Celtic imagery, eventually the leprechaun. But the creature had changed completely. No more was he the sly fairy cobbler of rural legend. He was something fun, more playful, more bright and cheerful. The illustrations that came from him were adapted into advertisements that began to portray this leprechaun with bright green coat, tall buckled hat, and a cheerful expression that was loved by children and adapted by mainstream cereal companies. Instead of the mysterious guarding creature that had once become so feared in the Irish lore, he was replaced with luck, Irish pride, and celebration. Popular culture articulated its transformation, and holiday decorations, greeting cards, eventually television, used the leprechaun as a way to recognize Irish culture. The smiling little man with a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. The darker folklore still hidden in the background. Because if you look closely at the older stories, the ones recorded of rural Ireland long before characters appeared on cereal boxes and parade floats, a different creature really does emerge. Not of a lucky charm, but of a clever and unpredictable little fairy spirit, a creature that guards its treasure carefully, and one that has always managed to outsmart the humans who tried to steal it. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for exploring the world of the leprechaun with me. And if you have any stories of your own from Irish lore that you want to share with us, please do. We always love hearing your stories. We always love hearing cultural traditions. So say hi. Remember to hit that follow button. It helps us grow and it helps other spooky people like yourself follow our show and join us as we dive deeper into folklore. And if you haven't checked out our socials, please do at Let's Talk Spooky Pod on TikTok and at Let's Talk Spooky on Instagram. I post side stories there, little spook stories, as well as Freaky Shit Friday, which is where we go over all the freaky shit I found during the week. And on that note, have a happy St. Patrick's Day. Enjoy a pint for me, and as always, stay curious and stay spooky. This episode was written and produced by me, Shauna, and the team here at Let's Talk Spooky. All episode research can be found in the show notes below. If you have a creepy story that you want to share with us, email us at letstalkspookypodcast@gmail.com or check out our socials at Let's Talk Spooky Pod on TikTok and Let's Talk Spooky on Instagram.